Alrighty, welcome to lecture number 24, the early 20th century modernism in North America. We'll start with Frida Kahlo, as she was an artist very much in line with the surrealists across the pond. She sought to paint her inner reality. A third of all her paintings were self-portraits. She said, "I paint myself because I am so often alone and because I am the subject I know best." She married the very famous muralist Diego Rivera. Together, they were two people with strong wills and short tempers. Maybe predictably, they divorced, but then remarried. Perhaps they were soulmates in a way, not that either one was particularly faithful to the other. She was seriously injured in a traffic accident when she was 18. A bus she was riding drove into a streetcar. Her lower abdomen was pierced by a pole, and her spine was severely damaged. Even after 35 surgeries, she never permanently recovered, and she was unable to have a baby. This painting shows the ionic column forming her spine. Her chest opened up, shattered by trauma. Her strength is broken, and her body is about to burst out of her corset, the braces barely holding her together. Here are two of her paintings side by side. A lot of her work deals with past trauma. She was a steadfast and proud person despite all the pain. Outwardly, at least, she was stoic and strong. Now let's move to the United States. Let's talk a bit about photography. Photography has changed art dramatically since its invention. It's a medium in which light is used to record an image on a photosensitive surface. It's an inexpensive means of recording comprehensible images. It captures and recreates optical experience rather faithfully. It was able to record objective truths. Of course, that last statement I just made is entirely untrue. What it really does is select the particular slice of the reality that the photographer chooses to include in the camera frame. And I like to tell the story about truth in photography. Imagine you're in a classroom with a teacher and there's a photographer there that wants to capture the level of engagement of the students with the class. And so they look around the room and they see a student there who's bright-eyed and asking questions and raising their hand and taking a picture of this person with their eyes wide and an inquisitive expression on their face. It's like, oh, you see, here's a really engaging teacher who's great. But then you could also take a picture of that one student in the corner who's got their head down on the desk, and then take a picture of that, and it's proof. It's objective proof that this teacher is a terrible teacher who bores his students to death. It all depends on how you frame it. And that's the power of the photographer, because when we see a photograph, it's hard for us not to believe what the photograph tells us. But you always have to remember that that photograph, it's the one particular slice that the photographer chose to show you. Nevertheless, it did allow for a new way of seeing. And avant-garde artists were certainly attracted to photography. It was seen as the most modern form of creating imagery. And early photography often tried to mimic painting. There was this style of pictorialism, soft focus with almost painterly effects in the photographs that was very popular. But eventually there was a shift toward what was called straight photography, which embraced the inherent qualities of the medium itself. This is Alfred Stieglitz, an American who elevated the status of photography to fine art. This is his photograph Steerage, 1907, chloride print. The steerage was the lower class accommodations on a ship. So this photograph captured the tiers of society. The steerage was also where passengers were held when immigrants were denied passage into the United States. This has a conscientiously balanced composition, as if he were composing a painting. But he believed in not manipulating the medium of photography in any way, unlike surrealists like Man Ray and popular pictorialist photographers. Here's the equivalent for 1923. Stieglitz was determined to prove photography was an artistic medium on par with painting and sculpture. This is part of a series of cloud photos, or 220 of them comprise the entire series. They were abstract and categorically modernist, with a contrast that was striking. When they first appeared, photography had been generally recognized as a distinct form of art for no more than 15 years. But until he introduces his cloud photos, there was no tradition of photographing something that was not recognizable in both form and content through photography. Stieglitz was an American, but he had connections to European art culture. Through these connections, he helped America become culturally relevant. Georgia O'Keeffe is another artist I want to talk about. She, in fact, was married to Alfred Stieglitz. In her work, she elevates the ordinary, much like Stieglitz photographs do, but these were paintings. And the imagery in them was often so zoomed in that they created abstract forms. Georgia O'Keeffe was probably the most innovative American artist before World War II. She forces us to notice something we normally overlook entirely. In her distinctive style, she painted skulls, plants, flowers, and other natural objects through organic forms. And they took on an air of eroticism and sensuality. She denied the seemingly obvious sexual associations of her compositions. She described her work like this. Here's a quote. "When you take a flower in your hand and really look at it, it's your world for a moment. I want to give that world to someone else. Most people in the city rush around so they have no time to look at a flower. I want them to see it, whether they want to or not. Surprising in their monumentality, the modest subjects in these paintings are larger than life size. The changing scale creates a transformation, and indeed a transcendence." Here's Grant Wood's American Gothic, 1930. This is a somewhat humorous work. It depicts salt-of-the-earth people in the Midwestern portion of the United States. A style known as regionalism was popular in the 1930s. It was often shunned by the city. It depicted rural scenes, reassuring images of the American heartland during the Great Depression. Grant Wood was one of its most important figures. This scene takes place in rural Iowa, Wood's birthplace. It shows a farmer and the farmer's daughter. It was read by some as satire, but Wood rejected that interpretation. Meanwhile, there was an artistic outpouring in New York, the blossoming of African American culture. Harlem was a neighborhood uptown from Central Park in Manhattan, and it was the hub of this new movement. Art of the Harlem Renaissance reflected pride in African American history and culture, everyday life, and the historical collective memory. Here's a painting by Aaron Douglas, From Slavery Through Reconstruction, Aspects of Negro Life. This was one of 4 in a series executed under the Public Works of Art Project, PWAP. It was a precursor to the WPA, which we'll discuss. Douglas was also an illustrator and a muralist. His work reflects modern and traditional African heritage and cultural pride. Muted tones enhance the sophistication of the piece. This is one of 4 panels divided into 3 sections. There are overlapping transparent forms along with undulating concentric circles. The circles may suggest music, the burgeoning jazz scene, as well as traditional spirituals. It also reflects a blending of sources, everything from Art Deco to Cubism and even Egyptian and Sub-Saharan African art. Of course, by now we were in the midst of the Great Depression. The world economy was in shambles. The Works Progress Administration was set up by Franklin Roosevelt and employed thousands of otherwise unemployed artists. It was one part of the broader New Deal that transformed the social fabric of American life. It goes way beyond art. But a lot of important American artists got their start with the WPA. Dorothea Lange is one. This is Migrant Mother, 1936. It's a truly iconic image of the Great Depression. The Resettlement Administration, a government relief program, administered aid to farming families affected by the Depression. Lang was hired to work for the government to document the plight of those suffering the most during the Great Depression. She took this photo in California's Nipomo Valley, and it depicts the plight of migrant farmers, specifically pea pickers. And if you read The Grapes of Wrath, you kind of know the situation. We emotionally connect with the face of the mother, shown between two children whose burden she carries on her shoulder. It humanizes her. Here's Edward Hopper's Nighthawks. It evokes Depression-era angst felt by so many at the time. It's a quiet, still image with lots of empty space. Its themes include the nature of modern life, isolation, alienation. These things pervade the work, and it's quintessentially American, stark in its depiction, with distinct simplification of shapes that strips away all the distracting details. This was painted right after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It represents a bleak psychological state that held the country in its grasp, a sort of melancholic apprehension about the future. These people are lost in their own thoughts, remote and somewhat indifferent to one another. But the figures also seem vulnerable. Oddly, there's no exit shown in the painting for the diner. Just the eerie green fluorescent lights when it only just recently been invented at the time. It's like suspended time in a non-specific location, but one that seems familiar. Maybe the coldness of urban life. It sort of feels like these people are waiting for something. And indeed, something big was about to come. But now we're going to shift our attention to architecture. Louis Sullivan was part of the Chicago School, responsible for the invention of the skyscraper. This started in the Midwest, in urban areas with urban sprawl. Where space was limited, there was a newfound need for more verticality. There was also a need for more fireproof buildings. In the late 1800s, there were multiple fires in cities across America that did extensive, widespread damage and ruined lives. The other influence on the emergence of the skyscraper was an improved technology for passenger elevators. Sullivan was born in Boston. He went to MIT, but there was a building boom in Chicago, so he moved there in 1878. His first major work was the Wright building. This structure was erected for a wealthy St. Louis brewer. Wide windows to illuminate the interior, and widest at the bottom where there would be storefronts. There were 7 identical floors of offices, and the outward appearance reflects the inside function. Sullivan said, "Form follows function," which became a maxim. This is the first modernist building. An internal steel frame skeleton supports the whole thing. Steel frame construction is a skeleton and skin structural system. A steel cage is put up, and then a skin of some other material covers it. The steel cage can bear the weight of the entire building. No longer is a building's weight borne on its walls. This allowed for the creation of a towering multi-story buildings. Like the Chrysler Building. This came a bit later. It was completed in 1930. It was the world's tallest building for 1 year until the Empire State Building took that honor. It was a skeleton and skin format with curtained walls, and it was more ornamental than its more famous counterpart. Influenced by industrial design and Art Deco, it featured an elongated, elegant design, streamlined, repeating fan shapes that are almost like a crown placed on top of the building. Walter Gropius was a leader of the Bauhaus School of Art and Architecture in Germany. It tried to eliminate boundaries between the arts and sought to bring together art, architecture, and design in its curriculum. It believed in fusion between art and architecture and a lack of strict delineation, and emphasized the need for architects to consider the function of the building, to accommodate modern needs, and to make use of the latest technology. It was free of ornamentation and functional. It let lots of light in for all the workshops inside. It was comprised of rectilinear forms, and it declares the materials in which it is composed, with no urge to disguise them. This is the shop block building, housed studios and work areas for students, with the reinforced concrete skeleton and glass skin. The interior featured large areas of open space where people could collaborate and interact with little separation. This is from the Bauhaus manifesto, of what they're striving to achieve. Positive attitude to living environment of vehicles and machines, organic shaping of things in accordance with their current laws, avoiding all romantic embellishment and whimsy. A restriction of basic forms and color to what is universally intelligible. Simplicity, economy and use of space, materials, time, and money. But maybe the most important modernist architect is Frank Lloyd Wright. His prairie style was an early 20th century movement created by Frank Lloyd Wright that relies on strong horizontal lines in imitation of the flatness of the American prairies. In fact, he integrates the context of the building into the architecture itself and creates indoor space as an extension of outdoor space. Frank Lloyd Wright is the most important modernist architect in America. Because he sought to connect architecture with its natural surroundings, he often employed local stone, wood, bricks into the design. He wanted buildings to exist in nature, in the landscape, and to look like they really belong in the place they exist. He built falling water directly into a cliff and around the waterfall, and used cantilevers to allow for the overhanging of concrete terraces. A cantilever is a horizontal form supported only on one side, and these cantilevers echo the long slabs of rock below. He was also famous for the open plans of his homes, whereby rooms flowed into each other instead of each room being compartmentalized. And that's it for our lecture today. Next time, with appropriate trepidation, we'll see what's going on back in Europe as the 1930s draw to a close. Just a hint, it's not pretty.